This is episode 13, so if you're superstitious, perhaps you shouldn't listen to this one. But then, if you're very seriously superstitious, you probably shouldn't listen to any of my podcasts. In episode 12, I talked about my father's death and the fact that I didn't go to his funeral and why I didn't go to his funeral. My wife Eve, in listening to it, decided that I hadn't been totally honest, that I hadn't made any mention at all of hostility toward my mother and any effect that might have had in my decision. Well, of course, I would like to flatter myself and say that that was not a huge factor. But the truth is, we don't really know anything about the internal mechanisms of our decision making. And however slight my hostility may seem to me consciously, I don't know to what extent it may have tipped my thinking one way or the other. How our decisions usually work is we find ourselves having made a decision. After the fact, we rationalize the reasons and we think of all the excuses or reasons why we made that decision. So I'm, of course, in the same boat as all other human beings. That's how I proceed. But in the interest of honesty and thoroughness, I thought I should discuss my hostility toward my mother, which I haven't experienced very often in recent years. It's usually been very short-lived when that feeling does arise. And I can speculate about why I'm hostile toward my mother, and who knows how right or wrong my speculations might be, but I'll give you my best guess, and you can judge for yourself. Usually hostility, I think, emerges from people being disappointed in their expectations or desires relative to the behavior of another person, and that's what seems to be the case with me. The short version is that I want her to appreciate me as a person, to like me and be interested in me. And in fact, she isn't. I am her son. I am her biological offspring. And how she thinks about me is pretty much determined by the culture she grew up in and her exposure to that culture. I talked in episode 12 about how people identify with various social groupings, including their own families, their own genetically related human beings. There are very good evolutionary reasons for why a parent would care about the well-being of their offspring, and she cares in the sense that she's very much interested in my health, if I'm well, and in my happiness. She doesn't particularly want to know why I'm happy, but she's interested in knowing whether or not I'm happy. So has that biological interest. But she has expectations about how a son should behave toward his mother that are based on her history in a particular culture. Of course, my expectations of her are conditioned by my own experience of the culture that I grew up in, and of course everything that's happened since. That's true of both of us. I think her probably early conditioning has been more enduring than mine has. But at any rate, one of the cultural expectations, at least in the culture that I grew up in, about how an offspring should feel about the parent. I'm sure I've heard this phrase. My sister comes to mind, although any number of people could have said it, is, without her, you wouldn't be alive. That sort of thinking, that's a reason to appreciate someone and be grateful for someone, is probably true in many cultures. The idea that we should be grateful for life. But in a way, that point of view supposes and reifies that there might be some other perspective from which we could view our situation. Imagine yourself as yourself, floating in the void somewhere without a body, however difficult that may be for you to imagine, thinking to yourself, floating there in the void, wow, I wish I was alive. I sure would be grateful if some human beings would give birth to me and nurture me. Well, of course, from my point of view, that hypothetical situation is totally unbelievable. There's no such thing imaginable. But to say, I'm glad I'm alive, in a way, it supposes another perspective from which one could view one's situation. And there really is no other perspective from which one can view our situation as human beings, as living animals. In a way, that's a rather nonsensical statement. It makes sense to me to say, wow, I'm glad I took that walk. That was a very enjoyable experience. And my saying that maybe will have something to do with me repeating it and doing it again if I take note of the fact that it was an enjoyable experience. To say, I'm glad I took that walk, supposes the opposite, which is in fact very possible. I might not have taken the walk if circumstances had been different, in which case I wouldn't have had the experience. But the opposite of being alive is being non-existent. So it's not an alternative. If I had never been born, I wouldn't know otherwise. I would never know. The life existed as a possibility. There would be no point of view from which to say, I wish I was alive. So to say that I should be grateful because these people, my parents, gave me life doesn't make much sense to me. A question that seems appropriate in understanding the situation is, when Willie Lou got pregnant, did she have me in mind? Was she thinking, oh, I know just what he will be like? And of course she didn't. She probably didn't even consider the option of not getting pregnant. It was pretty much expected in her time that women would get pregnant and have children, especially if they were married. There's all sorts of conditioning, and there are some very strong biological urges in that direction for women. I know women in this day and age who are very much aware of birth control and how to avoid having children, and they want to have a child badly, especially the closer they approach menopause. So it's possible to very much want children, which I don't think was the case with my mother as far as having it as an option. It was just something that one did. So she didn't do it on my behalf as a person. She did it so that she might have an offspring. She had, I think, in mind certain cultural expectations of what her relationship with that offspring would be. And they didn't really have that much to do with the personality or the opinions, likes and dislikes of the offspring. They had to do with that role-specified behavior appropriate to parents and children. Another reason that children are supposed to be grateful to their parents is for all the things they did while they were raising you, the care that they gave. Of course, as I've talked about earlier, I talked in episode 12 about pride and respect and how nonsensical those terms were. And to really revere someone for any behavior that they might perform doesn't make sense in light of the fact that that behavior was not initiated by some independent entity in that person's brain. That behavior, whatever it was, grew out of a life of conditioning. Of course, that includes biological imperatives as well. So my mother and father's behavior in caring for me as I was growing up was something that they didn't really have any choice about. Their culture told them how, and their particular exposure to that culture determined how they would take care of me. So I can't really say that they had any options. They didn't have really any choice but to behave as they did. So why should I be grateful? Gratitude, as I said about respect and pride, implies that there is an option, that there is something inside a person that independently of their history and their culture could decide to do one thing or not. And I don't think there is any such entity, and I'm in pretty good company these days. Some offspring, perhaps, are content to fulfill this generic role as son or daughter. It could be that they are so much enmeshed in the same culture that their parents were, that there's not that much divergence between the kind of people that they are and the kind of person that their parent is. So the parents take an interest in them as a fairly close approximation of themselves. They don't see a lot of difference, a lot of cultural difference. This person that they have raised is individual for sure, but not so different from themselves that they don't relate to the child as an individual. But because of my history, I turned out to be very much different than my parents. And because of my own personal history, I wanted them to appreciate me as the individual human being I had become. For my father, it was totally out of the question because he's a nuts and bolts kind of a guy. He was interested in any sort of handyman project I might do, and he related to that and felt a sense of pride that I could do things. But these cerebral sort of intellectual things were way beyond him. And my mother, she was capable of listening to me, attempt to explain myself, wanting for her to understand me and appreciate me, and she gave thoughtful responses. She seemed interested. But the things that I was telling her did not mesh very well with her own views of the world and how a person could think and the values that they might have. And so what happened was that not very long after we had had one of these profound conversations lasting into the night, it would be as if it had never happened. She reverted to thinking of me in the way that she always had, as this dutiful son, which I have to say I had been in large measure. I tried to fulfill their expectations for many years, wanting them to like me, wanting them to appreciate me, thinking that if I made them happy, then they would take more of an interest in me. This is my analysis in retrospect of what was going on. It's very hard to say really what my motivations were at the time, but looking back, that's the explanation that I give to my behavior. At any rate, it never happened. As I say, she could listen and she could pay attention and comment, but it didn't stick. None of it stuck. It was totally erased from her memory banks in a very short time afterwards. I eventually gave up. I came to the realization that what I had wanted was never going to happen. She was never going to appreciate me, never going to understand me. There was no point in my hoping for that, and no point in trying to make it happen. I can tell you that in those attempts to try and get her to understand me and like me and being frustrated in that, there was some hostility when I would find that it hadn't happened. Once I came to the understanding that it wasn't going to happen, that it was something that she was as incapable of as was my father, who couldn't really even bear to listen to the conversations. He would go to bed. I realized it wouldn't happen, and somewhere along the way, I came to the realization, actually, it was the very same realization I had with my third wife. I had thought that if I could make her happy, then I would be happy. When I came to the realization that I could not make her happy, I realized also that I didn't really care that much about her as a person. And when I realized I couldn't make my mother happy, that realization made it possible for me to look at her as a person in a way that I never had before. I had seen her in terms of my desires, of what really that I wanted from her. I wanted love and appreciation. And when I came to the realization that she just was not capable of giving me what I wanted, I began to look at her and both my parents and say, well, who are these people? What do I have in common with them? And why should I be interested in them? There's a difference between my mother and my father. My father is a caregiver. He had a lot to do with who I am, with the kind of a guy I became, because I became very much like him. I cannot resist. I cannot resist taking care of people and things and plants. It even is true of me and my relationship with my house plants. I get depressed, maybe not depressed, I get deeply concerned when they're not doing well. Oh God, what can I do? It's an emotional reaction. If I get that way about plants and pets that I've had, it's been the same thing. Imagine how I get in a relationship with another human being, particularly a woman. It's Hatcher all over again. Nonetheless, it's an endearing quality in him. I had a fondness for him because he was such a self-sacrificing person. Now, he didn't lick it off the grass, as Mary Casolaro used to say. He came by it the way we all come about our personalities. So I can't give him any credit for it, but nonetheless, it engenders a certain emotional response in me that I don't have for my mother, because she was the one who was taken care of. In a way, it may have had something to do with his living as long as he did, because as long as there was Willie Lou for him to take care of, he had a purpose in life, and that may have had something to do with his living as long as he did. So again, it's one of those things that's difficult to unravel. I identify with my father. I have fondness for him. I have sympathy for him. I saw him really being a slave to my mother. I may not have been able to free myself from the emotional response to another human being. If someone is around and in need, I cannot seem to turn off that emotional response. But I have learned to avoid being around people. And that's really perhaps my only salvation, is that if there's no one around, then there's no one for me to focus on as an object of caregiving. So I am a victim, as we all are, of my conditioning. And whether or not that will ever change, I don't know. In a way, it's not something to regret horribly. It is an endearing quality. At the same time, it's affected my life in ways that, in retrospect, I sort of wish I could undo. It's pointless to second guess our life and how it might have been, but nonetheless, So I had a certain fondness for my dad, even after I realized that he didn't have a clue who I was, even less than my mother. The idea of him trying to comprehend me is something that he would himself have just turned away from in fear, I think, probably. It was just too alien for him. He managed to suppress those kinds of reactions, and he just thought of me as his kid. And he got a huge kick if I did something in a handyman kind of a way. My mother, as I say, I didn't relate to her so much. I didn't identify with her so much, although I'm sure she's had many profound influences on who I am. She's not the kind of person that I want to be. And she's not the kind of person that I really want to be around. Because it's not her fault. But really all she's concerned about is being taken care of. What she would like is for me to move to Florida into the spare room and take over Hatcher's job. I would do the laundry and the shopping and the cooking, and I would take care of the house and do repairs, and I would keep the yard cleaned up and drive her hither and yon. And that's what she would want me to be. Well, why should I do that for a person that I don't really care about, that I'm not really interested in, and who really isn't interested in me except for the things that I can do for her? I have pretty much, I think, gotten used to the idea that's the situation. That's how my mother is. That's how she feels about me, and that's how I feel about her. I have made some efforts to take care of her. My dad, especially when he was alive too, he needed care. In the end, they reversed roles a bit because he needed more care than he could give. And I have to say, she rose to the occasion. She did fairly well. But she resented it. It wasn't her modus operandi. It wasn't the way she liked to be by any stretch of the imagination, which is one reason she wanted me to go to Florida and take over. Well, I was just not willing to do that. I was willing to do research and find places where the two of them could live and Dad could get the care he needed and she could have a nice place to live. They would have services available and wouldn't need me to be there and fulfill that role. Well, she wasn't interested. He wasn't interested, definitely, because by that time, his mental faculties had deteriorated to the point where he was lost in strange surroundings. And if he had been moved into another place, he would not have known where he was. I'm afraid he'd be one of those guys peeing in the closet or something, waking up confused and not knowing where he was. Now that he's dead, her brain is still working fairly well. She drives for herself. She takes care of herself. But she doesn't want to move either. She's been in that house for 50 years plus, and she's happy there, she's comfortable there, and she doesn't want to go anywhere else. And I can understand that. But I'm not going to be the person to make that possible. I'm sure if I ever get in their circumstances, in her circumstances or his, where I can't take care of myself, I will have to leave my little apartment or whatever place I have turned into my little nest, then I will be disappointed. But I've had a life pretty much where I move fairly readily in response to circumstances, and I usually make a new place for myself easily enough. Something that she is probably not too capable of doing at this point. She has managed, and this is something that I was hoping. She's managed to discover how capable she is of taking care of herself now that there's no one there to do it. And it's been good for her in a way. I'm sure she would still rather have someone there. But it's been good for her to find out that, hey, I can do this. I can take care of this. I can handle this situation. And she still drives. She had a recent experience where, the house was falling apart. The floor was rotted out and underneath was rotted out. And she found out the insurance would pay to have it repaired. She took care of that. She pursued it and got them to do it, and there were major difficulties along the way. People doing shoddy work and not wanting to do it right, not wanting to correct it. She wouldn't have it. She had to have it done right, and they were going to do it right, and she was going to find out why not if they didn't. She's been very persistent in getting what she wants and has been very successful. She finally has the bathroom rebuilt, part of the kitchen floor as well. She's handled the situation much better than she probably would have imagined some time ago when she was still in the mode of being dependent. In episode 12, I talked about how people identify with their genetic relations and their neighbors and their communities and their religions and their countries and so forth, and how that causes problems. The only solution I could imagine to those problems was for people to somehow free themselves from their attachments to these smaller human groups and become more associated in their identity with humanity as a whole. At this point, I've talked somewhat about my own struggles with the cultural conditioning, the genetic connections, and so forth. I have been fortunate, I think, in my own individual history, allowing me to be as free as I am from those identifications. What it amounts to in the end, rather than devote my energies and my time and my own golden years to the care and maintenance of someone just because they are genetically related to me, is something that I don't have to do. I have been freed somewhat. The way I look at it, it's there's a lot of little old ladies in the South. Everywhere else, there's a lot of little old ladies that need care, and they need someone to take care of them. And there are people who are in a lot worse shape than my mother is. If my concern is with humanity as a whole, then perhaps I can better direct my efforts than to devote them to taking care of Willie Lou. I can be concerned and spend my time trying to enhance the welfare of mankind as a whole. Of course, that's a rather grandiose sounding approach to myself and my own goals and attitudes toward life. And you, I think, perhaps by now, can judge to what degree that is a fair and accurate representation of who I am. As I said in the very beginning of this, I have no idea why I do the things I do. I have rationalizations. And of course, the rationalizations I prefer are the ones that put me in a very favorable light in terms of the values that I have acquired along the way. The fact that I'm here in California, I'm making a podcast and telling you about my mother and my relationship. The fact that I'm doing that, instead of taking care of her, proclaiming that my motivation is that I can probably improve the state of more people in doing this than in taking care of her, is a pretty grandiose idea. By now you can judge just how grandiose it is and whether or not anything I have said at any point is of any benefit to anyone. I await your response. I'm waiting to hear. Am I totally full of it? Am I full of my own grandiosity, or have I been of some help? I don't know. I really don't know. You let me know. I was listening to what I've recorded so far and realized that there were some loose ends I wanted to tie up and some loose language that I had used that I had needed to make a little more precise. I talked in several of the earlier podcasts about how the brain works and how it's evolved and its job, and the fact that a large part of its job is to orient us in the social environment, and of course in the physical environment as well. But as we human beings got more complicated and got language, then orienting in the social environment got to be a huge factor in our survival and well-being. And so everything I've said about identifying with religion and ethnicity and family and community and so forth have to do with people orienting themselves in the social environment. In talking about ways to try to avoid the disadvantages of that, the hostility between groups and the antagonism, one of the things I failed to mention that has occurred to me and I actually have been promoting for a long time is globalization of world markets. And that's a touchy subject with a lot of people, mainly because I think in its present form there are a lot of difficulties and inconveniences and inequities and human suffering involved. I think there are quite a few improvements that could be made on it. We're beginning to regulate corporations somewhat so that they have to ensure the origins of their products, the working conditions of the people that make the products. Fair trade has gotten to be an issue. There are many ways, then, that this globalization process, which I think is pretty inevitable, there are many ways that it could be improved. The reason that I have promoted it and thought that it was a good thing reminds me of a story that my uncle, who was a farmer in Georgia, told. He had someone visiting from the north, a Yankee, of course, and he was driving him around the countryside, giving him a look at southern Georgia. And one of the things that impressed the visitor that they mentioned to my uncle was that you would see these houses tucked up in the woods with no farm around them or anything, and he wondered how those people made a living. My uncle said, well, they all wash and iron clothes for one another. So there's some overtones in that are unsavory. Nonetheless, the point is that I think the only way we're ever going to end hostility in the world is if we're all washing and ironing clothes for one another. If our economies are so intertwined and involved that we can't really initiate hostilities against people somewhere else, because to do so would cut us off from some sort of commodity that we have grown accustomed to and decided is essential to our well-being. There are some huge problems, and among those, one of the things that people lament is the loss of native cultures as these corporations move in and as they get more modern conveniences like cars and strip malls and so forth. The native culture disappears, gets eroded and disappears, and how that's a lamentable loss. And I agree. It would be a shame. But at the same time, in a way, what we're saying is that for the sake of our entertainment and amusement and gratification, these people who live in less advanced cultures should stay less advanced, and they should keep doing things in those very interesting and cute, archaic ways, doing everything by hand and so forth. So people embrace the differences between cultures on that level. I agree. It makes the world very interesting if there are all these different art forms and handicrafts and so on and so forth. At the same time, there is a lack of medical treatment, and people suffer from things that they wouldn't have to if they participated in the larger world culture. What I foresee, and one thing that I think is essential to the long-term equality of people, is that at least some of these differences have to be erased. They need to be erased because otherwise hostilities will continue. There's an upside to the growth of global culture, as ugly as it can be in many of its forms. There are many difficulties that are going to have to be worked out. But in the long run, I think for the good of humanity as a whole, it's necessary if we are ever to get along peacefully with one another, if we're more alike. I have a vision of the future where everyone is sort of mocha colored. No white people, no black people, no red people, no Asian people. Everybody's a sort of a homogeneous blend. And you may lament that, but it may be that the hybridization of the human animal will have some other benefits that we haven't totally foreseen yet. At any rate, that's a subject that we could discuss for a very long time. I just wanted to give it at least cursory attention here because it does relate to a lot of the things that I've said. Another thing that I should clarify in talking about the grandiosity of my ideas and my preference for complementary rationalizations for my behavior. That all, I think, has to do with social identity as well. There's a part of the brain that Michael Gazzaniga has named the interpreter. Its job is to present us to the world, to present a coherent picture of our behavior to the world. To do that in a way, of course, that enhances our position in the social environment and that gets us the approval of our fellows so that we may prosper in the environment. And I have that too. There's no way to get around it. My interpreter would like to see me in the best possible light. What the best possible light, of course, is depends on the values that I've assimilated, that each of us has assimilated. So I have a value that says grandiosity is not a good thing. It's something that should be guarded against. We should keep an eye out for it. Nonetheless, I find myself with these grandiose thoughts, thinking about how I might yet save the world or a small portion of it, wanting in general to appear favorably. What I want to keep in mind, despite these little character flaws, and I want you to keep in mind as well, is that even while I am soliciting your good opinion, trying to appear favorably in your estimation, I know that my efforts in that direction, any achievements I might have that might favorably dispose you toward me, any way that I can present myself that might favorably dispose you toward me, are gifts. There's nothing in me that has ever done anything that was not a direct result of the influences that impinged on this organism and its abilities to assimilate those, to cobble them into some sort of representation of the organism as a whole. There's no way that I can take credit for anything that I've ever done, in spite of my soliciting your good opinion. That said, I think I've probably said enough. I hope you're well and happy wherever you are. I hope you have a long and prosperous life. Goodbye for now.